Begin this morning with the litany of legal matters that Donald Trump faces in the week ahead. Now, less than 24 hours from now, a panel of judges in the Court of Appeals in D.C. will hear arguments regarding the gag order filed against the former president in his federal election interference case. Now, recall, that order was originally imposed last month by the presiding judge, Tanya Chutkan, to stop Trump from making incendiary comments related to the case. These comments included threats against possible witnesses. Now, attorneys with the special prosecutor's office say that the gag order is necessary to ensure a fair trial because Trump's unrestrained comments could prejudice their case. It's common sense. You're talking bad about witnesses. You have a huge platform. We can only imagine what happens. You will actually be able to hear the proceedings yourself because the audio is going to be live streamed online beginning at 9:30 a.m. tomorrow. This is a must listen. This whole issue has now taken on a particular significance as the former president's recent speeches and social media posts have grown more and more alarming and unrestrained. Now, tomorrow's hearing should not be confused with the other gag order in one of the other cases against the former president that he is also appealing. On Thursday, an appeals court in New York temporarily lifted the gag order placed on Trump and his attorneys in the civil fraud case that is currently in trial right here in Manhattan. That gag order, narrow as it was, came from Judge Arthur Engoron and prevents Trump and his legal team from making comments against the court staff after they previously and repeatedly targeted Judge Engoron's law clerk in and out of the courtroom. They accused her of bias and having a basic prejudice against the former president. This gag order is going to remain paused at least until November 27th, when the full panel of appeals court judges will convene to consider the matter. But see, here's the thing about it. Within hours of that gag order being lifted on Thursday, Donald Trump went back to predictably being Donald Trump. He repeatedly attacked Engoron's clerk again, calling her, quote, politically biased and out of control. So very interesting and rich when you consider the source. Joining me now is Joanne Freeman, professor of history and American studies at Yale University and author of Field of Blood, Violence in Congress and the Road Civil War. Also with us is Jack Beauchamp, senior correspondent for Vox, covering challenges to democracy and right-wing populism. Zach, I want to start with you. You wrote an article last week with the headline, quote, "When Trump tells you he's an authoritarian, believe him." In it, you wrote, quote, "Trump is talking like a fascist, planning fascist policies and staffing up with fascists. While a second Trump term is vanishingly unlikely to produce an openly fascist state, that's not really how authoritarian takeovers of democracy work today. It's quite plausible that they could do extensive, even fatal damage to the American system by pulling the right policy levers. The fascist ideological positioning is a signal of intent. Trump is coming for American democracy. No one can say they weren't warned." Those are very, very strong words. Now, beyond Trump's increasingly alarming speeches, what are the red flags that you think people should be paying attention to?
So in the past few weeks, there have been a series of reports on the policy planning process in a second Trump administration, which have made me, as somebody who studies the decline of democracy around the world, exceptionally alarmed. And I want to run through a few of them. One you may have heard of is a proposal to politicize the Justice Department and in a variety of different ways to go after his political enemies, not on the justified grounds that Trump is currently being prosecuted on, but on flimsy pretexts. And part of that plan, one of the proposals that's embedded in it, is the invocation of the Insurrection Act, which would allow him to use the military against protesters if there were protests against these particular policy positions, right? There's others. There's a proposal to, and I'm not exaggerating here, round up enough immigrants that the current detention system would not be able to hold them, and they would be placed in detention camps. Another proposal would have them replacing as many as 50,000 career civil servants from a list of Trump allies put together by something called Project 2025 and a few other conservative-aligned movements, right? That would be a fundamental reorientation of the federal government and federal bureaucracy to be something that acts on Trump's will. So when you put all of those policy proposals together, right, this isn't like Trump's first term where he came in and he didn't really know what he was doing. There were quote unquote adults in the room who restrained his worst behavior. Here he's got a cadre of very organized, very professional people with detailed policy proposals that could be enacted on day one. This reminds me very much of Viktor Orban in Hungary, who is probably the most successful and savviest anti-democratic politician in the West today. And it's something that I think should really, really, really be alarming people.
You know, Zach, I'll tell you what it reminds me of as a huge Star Wars fan, and I've said this on air before, I'll say it again. It reminds me of Star Wars, Emperor Palpatine, and Project 2025 sounds a lot like Order 66 in terms of the threat that it takes to order and democracy and what those things should be and freedom. Joanne, I want to turn to you. A lot of people would shy away from using the F word, and it's Sunday, so I want to be very clear. F in this case means fascism. We've heard that term quite a bit, however, in relation to criticisms that Donald Trump has been using fascist language. Do you think that that's too strong in terms of describing it, or is it an appropriate characterization?
Oh, I think it's a very appropriate characterization, but it's an interesting point you make about the word, because I actually think almost the opposite. I think because it's an ism and because it's rooted in history, some people might not take it as strongly as they should. Because what we are talking about is an attack on democracy. And whether it has, the F word and an ism attached to it or not, people need to take that seriously. My fear, I've been sort of speaking about this for a while, and there's this article by Zach as well. There's going to be a lot more talk about this because this isn't going to go away. And, my fear is that people are going to begin to tune it out. And in a sense, they can almost tune it out more easily, more readily, because it's an ism, which feels somehow ethereal or abstract or intellectual. And they really shouldn't. We're talking about a real threat in our faces. And I think Americans are so accustomed to thinking in a kind of exceptionalist way about the United States that, basically we'll always be okay because we always have been, and that's the way the United States is. That's not practical language. That's not a practical way of reasoning right now. I think we really need to realize this is a moment of extreme contingency. We don't know what's going to happen, and we could wake up and we could step forward and we could take action and we can help push things in a better direction, or we cannot. And it's very possible that some very bad things are going to happen.
I talk to so many people who are really in disbelief of where we are, and I think haven't grasped how deep this rabbit hole can actually go. Zach, I want to talk to you and really set the scene. Yesterday, all right, Madison, Wisconsin, we have a group of people who are actually walking down the street, waving swastika flags and doing Nazi salutes. This is in broad daylight. There is no confusion in terms of where these people stand or how emboldened they are. What does that tell you about the rise of fascism and how white supremacist groups are feeling right now in this moment?
So my understanding of actions like fringe movements of that sort is that what they're doing is trying to push the boundaries of what can be acceptable in public life, right? A bunch of people marching around with swastika flags, they don't represent the Trump administration or Trump voters. That's not how the nature of the authoritarian threat coming from the mainstream Republican Party operates. But when you see this kind of uprising, what it tells you is that there's a component of the American fringe that feels like mainstream politics have shifted in a way that allow them to express their views publicly. And they're going to push on that door. And, there's a long history of American far-right movements trying to do this, from the George Lincoln Rockwell and the American Nazi Party trying to win electorally, from the alt-right in the mid-2010s when Trump first rose on the scene. And so when you see these kind of sort of explicit neo-fascist protests, what it tells me is that there's a sensation that their politics is going to be tolerated and is even at least somewhat reflected in the mainstream character of American politics. And that should be quite.
But Zach, I want to follow up with you really quickly. Do you think that it was something about Donald Trump that actually gave them that impression? Was it just his general presence in terms of being unconventional and bombastic and sort of just not politically correct that made them feel that they could do that? Or do you believe that it was something that he actually said, or was it his actual rhetoric that did it, or some combination of both?
Oh, I would say both, but I think the latter is more important, right? There are plenty of bombastic American politicians, but very few of them have used the extreme language that Trump has used and used the kinds of tropes that Trump has employed in talking about minority groups, right? And that, I mean, you can look directly at the way that certain far-right leaders have discussed Trump and certain other figures associated with the Trumpist movement, like Tucker Carlson, right? You have people talking about how these guys are mainstreaming their ideas, doing a better job articulating them than they've ever done, right? This is the rhetoric from the recent speech where Trump referred to his political opponents as vermin, to the way that around the time of, for example, the 2018 Tree of Life synagogue shooting, Trump repeated very similar ideas to the ones expressed by the shooter before he carried out the worst anti-Semitic massacre in American history, right? It creates a permission structure for extreme right politics to take to America's streets.
Joanne, I want to add to. I'll let you finish with the last thought. I had a question for you, but if you want to add, go right ahead.
I want to add because it's probably going to be along the lines of what you were just going to ask. What we're talking about here is the normalization of things that should not be normalized. Pushing the envelope is a way of normalizing things. And what we're seeing is not normal. It's not normal in a functional democracy. And that's the message that people should take away from this.
I totally agree. I was going to ask you, and I think you sort of alluded to that as you said, in terms of Congress now being on this long stretch of business that they've been in D.C., it has become increasingly tense, and there are more threats there as well. So you're not just talking about threats to democracy as some sort of ideological institution. You're talking about threats to the people who are actually supposed to uphold these institutions, and that is a very ominous sign when it comes to, where we're going. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
That was Joanne Freeman, professor of history and American studies at Yale University, and Jack Beauchamp, senior correspondent at Vox, who covers challenges to democracy and right-wing populism. Thank you to you both for helping us get started this Sunday morning.